Since childhood, you are taught that myths are just old fairy tales. School textbooks claim that the Greeks invented monsters, sailors told tall tales about sea serpents, and chroniclers lied about lost cities of gold just to entertain bored kings. The official narrative has always been simple. There is serious, boring history for scholars, and there is fantasy for entertainment. This is a lovely legend, but it misses the best part. Reality is far more absurd and shocking than any fiction. It turns out that many of these stories were actually eyewitness reports that mainstream historians simply refused to accept for decades. Today, we will reveal the first 11 historical myths that, to the horror of every expert, turned out to be the absolute truth. Fact 1. For almost 3,000 years, the Iliad by Homer was considered the greatest blockbuster of antiquity. It was an epic poem about war, heroes, and a giant wooden horse, which everyone viewed as a mere metaphor. Serious historians of the 19th century nodded politely and called it great literature, but they were certain the city never existed. Everything changed when Heinrich Schliemann entered the scene. He was not a professional archaeologist. He was an obsessed businessman and, basically, an Indiana Jones on steroids. He was a fanatic for Homer and decided to use the Iliad as a literal GPS navigator. The scientific community mocked him, but Schliemann went to Turkey and actually found Troy. But here is the catch. He was so obsessed with gold that he literally blasted through the ancient city with dynamite. He dug a massive trench through 9 layers of history, destroying most of the actual Troy he was looking for. He found a treasure, smuggled it out of the country, and held a photo shoot for his wife wearing ancient diadems. The myth was real, but it was found by a fanatic who erased several other civilizations along the way. Fact 2. The ancient Greeks were obsessed with stories about the Amazons. They told of an entire nation of fierce female warriors who fought the greatest Greek heroes. Official history claimed for a long time that this was just a sexist metaphor. Scholars said the Greeks feared strong women so much that they invented this nightmare to prove that male order would always defeat female chaos. This sounded logical, until modern archaeologists began digging up Scythian mounds from Ukraine to Siberia. They expected to find graves of male warriors and women with beads. Instead, they discovered female burials with full battle gear, including quivers full of arrows, spears, and heavy battle axes. Bone analysis confirmed exactly what the Greeks described: battle wounds, fractured skulls, and arrowheads embedded in bones. These women were active fighters who died in combat. The Greeks were not making things up. They were writing border reports about their real and very dangerous neighbors, the Scythian nomads. Fact 3. This is one of the most debated topics in American history. You were taught that Christopher Columbus discovered the New World, and for a long time this was a concrete fact. However, Icelandic sagas mentioned for 1,000 years that Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, reached a land called Vinland around the year 1000. He spent the winter there and fought with local tribes 500 years before Columbus was even born. Historians dismissed these stories as the drunken ramblings of bearded men. In the 1960s, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, archaeologist Anne Stein, decided to test the legends. They followed the sagas and found the settlement of Elance aux Meadows in Canada. Excavations proved it was a 100% Viking settlement with typical sod houses and a blacksmith forge. The myth was actually a precise ship log. Leif Erikson beat Columbus by half a millennium. The Spanish explorer just had a much better public relations manager in the following centuries. Fact 4. For centuries, Scandinavian sailors terrified each other with stories of the Kraken, a monster the size of an island that dragged entire ships to the bottom with its tentacles. In 1755, Bishop Pontoppidan described it in detail as the largest sea monster known to man. The enlightened scientists of that era laughed and blamed the stories on mass hysteria or too much rum. The legend of the Kraken was a synonym for a lie until the ocean began washing evidence onto the shore. In 1850, Danish zoologist Japetus Steenstrup obtained a giant beak from this mythical creature that was the size of a human head. It turned out the Kraken is not a myth. It is a real creature called Archaeoteuthis dux, or the giant squid. It is a beast reaching 60 feet in length that lives at extreme depths. The sailors were not lying. They were simply the first to see a monster that science refused to believe in for hundreds of years. Fact 5. Roman chroniclers loved to gather dirt on their rulers. They described Emperor Caligula as a mad psychopath who built 2 colossal ships on Lake Nemi for his own pleasures. These were floating villas with marble floors, heating, and lush gardens for hosting massive orgies. For a long time, this was considered black propaganda and artistic exaggeration. Historians did not believe the Romans could build such things just to dump the state budget into a deep lake. In 1927, Benito Mussolini came to power, and he was obsessed with the idea of reviving Roman greatness. He ordered Lake Nemi to be completely drained to check the ancient legend. When the water vanished, the world stood in shock. 2 giant vessels over 230 feet long lay on the bottom. They were true floating palaces with plumbing and complex mosaics. The myth turned out to be a modest report, but the saddest part happened later, in 1944. The Nazis burned the museum containing these unique ships. We proved the truth and lost it immediately. Fact 6. Herodotus, known as the father of history, often wrote very strange things. For example, he mentioned giant ants the size of foxes that lived in Persia and India. According to him, these creatures dug deep burrows and threw up mounds of gold dust. For centuries, this was the main argument against Herodotus. He was called the father of fake news. The idea of ants digging for gold seemed like a total absurdity. Everything changed in the 1980s when ethnologist Michel Paisel went to the Himalayas. He discovered that the ancient historian was not lying, but was a victim of a translation error. These ants were actually Himalayan marmots, which are indeed the size of a fox. They dig deep burrows in gold-rich soil and throw the sand to the surface, which locals still collect today. In the local dialect, the words for marmot and mountain ant sound almost identical. The myth was a real report that was slightly spoiled when translated from one language to another. Fact 7. Another incredible story from Herodotus concerned the lost city of Heraklion. He described this city as a flourishing Egyptian metropolis at the mouth of the Nile, which was supposedly visited by Helen of Troy herself. Later, the city vanished from all maps. Historians were 100% sure it was just another metaphor or a geographic error. The city was considered a ghost until the year 2000, when French underwater archaeologist Franck Godiot went looking for sunken Napoleonic ships. Instead of a fleet, he found an entire sunken city on the sea floor. This was the legendary Heraklion. The city was not a fiction. It simply sank under the weight of its massive stone buildings. Archaeologists found giant statues of pharaohs, majestic temples, and hundreds of anchors. An entire metropolis slowly slid underwater, in the 8th century due to soil liquefaction and earthquakes. It lay on the bottom for over 1,200 years, while academic science called it a beautiful fairy tale. Fact 8. This is the darkest chapter in the history of the founding of the United States. Rumors that the first English colonists in Virginia ate each other lasted for 4 centuries. They spoke of the terrible winter of 1609, which is officially called the Starving Time. Official historians always dismissed these stories as black propaganda from rivals or empty tales, claiming that English gentlemen would never do such a thing. In 2012, in a trash pit at the Jamestown fort, archaeologists made a horrifying discovery. They found the skull of a 14-year-old girl named Jane. The bones showed clear and unmistakable marks of butchery. There were precise but unskilled strikes with a hatchet to the forehead and the back of the head to open the skull. Forensic analysis confirmed it was a desperate act of post-mortem butchery to extract the brain for the survival of the others. The myth turned out to be a truth so grim that the American nation simply refused to admit it for 400 years. Fact 9. Everyone knows the legend of the labyrinth of the Minotaur on the island of Crete, where a monster lived that was half human and half bull. Of course, no one in their right mind was looking for the monster, but the existence of the giant labyrinth itself was considered pure fantasy. Everything changed when archaeologist Arthur Evans began excavations on Crete in the early 20th century. He dug up the Knossos Palace, and it became a global sensation. The palace was a colossal and chaotic structure of over 200,000 square feet with thousands of rooms, tangled corridors, and dead ends. Getting lost in such a building without a guide was easy. The entire palace was literally soaked in the bull cult. There were frescoes of athletes playing with giant animals everywhere. The symbols of the double axe, called the labrys, were seen all over, which likely gave the name to the word labyrinth. Evans found more than just ruins. He found a real architectural nightmare that formed the basis for one of the most famous myths in human history. Fact 10. For a long time, the Hittite Empire was considered an exclusively biblical legend. This people was mentioned several times in the Old Testament, but that was where the data ended. No Egyptian or Greek source confirmed their existence for a long time. Leading historians of the 19th century were firmly convinced that the Hittites were an invention of the Bible authors, and that such a people never existed in reality. All doubts vanished in 1834 when the ruins of the ancient city of Hattusa were found in modern Turkey. In 1906, full-scale excavations began, revealing the capital of a great empire and tens of thousands of clay tablets. It turned out that this mythical people was actually the third superpower of the Bronze Age, alongside Egypt and Assyria. It was they who fought the great Ramses II at the famous Battle of Kadesh. It turned out the Bible was absolutely accurate on this point, and the scientific skeptics were deeply mistaken. Fact 11. Icelandic sagas often mentioned magic sunstones used by the Vikings. Legends claimed that northern mariners had a mysterious crystal called a solarstein, which allowed them to determine the exact position of the sun even in the thickest fog or under total cloud cover. This gave them an incredible advantage in navigation and allowed them to cross the Atlantic without a compass. Scientists considered this a beautiful poetic metaphor for centuries and did not believe in such magic. However, in 1967, a Danish researcher suggested that the legend referred to a real mineral known as Iceland spar. This unique crystal has the property of double refraction and can polarize light. If you rotate it before your eyes, you can catch a certain pattern that unerringly points to the sun hidden behind the clouds. Later, such crystals were found on actual sunken Viking ships. The magic turned out to be advanced physics that ancient mariners mastered hundreds of years before modern scientists.